Chapter 9. Piotr Karpenko. This chapter will be devoted to Piotr Karpenko, friend of my childhood, who later became, by his own real achievements, and not merely by diploma, a prominent mining engineer, and who is now deceased. May he attain the kingdom of heaven. It will be sufficient, I think, for portraying all the aspects of the individuality of Piotr Karpenko, and also fulfilling my aim in this series of my writings, namely that the reader should obtain instructive and really useful material. If I begin this chapter by describing the circumstances in which our first inner intimacy arose, and then relate several incidents which occurred on one of our expeditions, during which there befell, by the will of fate, the misfortune which led to his premature death. This close friendship of ours began when we were still boys. I will describe what happened in as much detail as possible, the more so as this may very well throw light on certain aspects of the psyche of young scamps in general, some of whom may later grow up to be unusual men. We were living in the town of Kars, and at that time I was one of the choir boys of the Fortress Cathedral. I must say first of all that, after my teacher Boguchevsky had left Kars, and my first tutor, Dean Walsh, had gone away on leave of absence owing to illness, I was deprived of both of these men, who were real authorities for me. And as there was also talk in my family about the possibility of returning to Alexandropol in the near future, I no longer wished to remain in Kars, and began to think about going to Tiflis, where I had dreamed for a long time of joining what was called the Archdeacon's Choir, a proposal which had often been made to me, and which was very flattering to my youthful self-love. It was at this period of my life, while such dreams were still the centre of gravity of my as yet undeveloped thinking faculty, that early one morning there came running up to me one of the choristers of the Fortress Cathedral, an army clerk who had become my friend, chiefly because I sometimes bought him good cigarettes, which I must confess I filched surreptitiously from my uncle's cigarette case. Panting for breath, he told me that he had accidentally overheard a discussion between the commandant of the fortress, General Fadif, and the chief of the mountain police, about the arrest and cross-examination of several persons in connection with an affair relating to the artillery range, and my name had been mentioned as having possibly been mixed up in it. This news greatly alarmed me because I had, as is said, something on my conscience in connection with the artillery range, so, wishing to avoid any awkward possibilities, I decided not to delay my departure, but to leave Kars the very next day. This incident of the artillery range, through which a factor was formed in my psyche for engendering remorse of conscience, and on account of which I hurriedly made my departure, was the cause of my intimate friendship with Piotr Karpenko. At that particular time I had a number of friends of my own age, as well as others many years older. Among the former was one very agreeable boy, the son of a vodka manufacturer. His name was Ryazov or Ryaziv, I do not remember which. He often used to invite me to his house, and occasionally I would drop in without invitation. His parents spoiled him a great deal. He had his own separate room where we could prepare our lessons in comfort. On his writing table there was almost always a plateful of freshly baked pies of flaky pastry, of which I was then very fond. But what was perhaps most important was that he had a sister about 12 or 13 years old, who often came to his room when I happened to be there. A friendship sprang up between us, and, without noticing it, I fell in love with her. It seemed that she was not indifferent to me. In short, a silent romance began between us. Another friend of mine, the son of an artillery officer, also used to come there, and he, like us, was studying at home in order to enter some school, as he had not been admitted to the cadet corps, having been found a little deaf in one ear. This was Piotr Karpenko. He too was in love with the Ryazov girl, and she obviously liked him also. She was nice to him, it seems, because he often brought her sweets and flowers, and to me because I played the guitar well and was skilful at making designs on handkerchiefs, which she loved to embroider and say afterwards that she had designed herself. So here we were, both in love with this girl, and little by little, so to say, the jealousy of rivalry began to flame in us. Once, after evening service in the cathedral, where this breaker of hearts was also present, I thought out some plausible excuse and asked the choir master's permission to leave a little early, as I wished to meet her as she went out and accompany her home. At the doors of the cathedral I found myself face to face with my rival. Although hate for one another raged in both of us, we escorted Our Lady home like chivalrous knights, but after we had left her I could no longer restrain myself, and picking a quarrel over something or other, I gave him a sound thrashing. The evening after the fight, I went as usual with some of my comrades to the cathedral bell tower. At that time there was no real bell tower in the grounds of the fortress cathedral. It was just then being built, and the bells were hung in a temporary wooden structure with a high roof, rather like an octagonal sentry box. The space between the roof and the beams on which the bells hung was our club, where we met almost every day, and sitting astride the beams or on the narrow ledge around the walls under the roof, we smoked, told anecdotes, and even prepared our lessons. Later, when the permanent stone bell tower was completed and the bells put in there, this temporary one was presented by the Russian government to the new Greek church being built at that time, and there, it seems, it continues to serve as a bell tower. Besides the regular members of the club, I found there my friend Piotr from Alexandropol, who had come to Kars on a visit. He was the son of Kerensky, a postal telegraph inspector, who was later one of the officers killed in the Russo-Japanese War. There was also a boy from the Greek quarter of Kars, nicknamed Feki, whose real name was Gorkanidi, and who later became the author of many school books. He had brought homemade Greek halva as a present from his aunt to us choir boys, whose singing had often affected her to the depths of her soul. We sat, ate the halva, smoked and chatted. Soon after, Piotr Karpenko arrived with his eyes bandaged, accompanied by 2 other Russian boys, not members of the club. He came up to me demanding an explanation for my having insulted him the day before. Being one of those youths who read a good deal of poetry and loved to express themselves in highfalutin language, he delivered a lengthy harangue which he brought to an abrupt close with the following categorical declaration: "The earth is too small for both of us, hence one of us must die." On hearing this bombastic tirade, I wanted to knock this nonsense right out of his head, but when my friends began to reason with me, saying that only people who have not yet been touched at all by contemporary culture, as for instance Kurds, square accounts in this manner, and that respectable people have recourse to more civilised methods, my pride began to assert itself, and in order not to be called uneducated or cowardly, I entered into a serious discussion of this incident. After a lengthy dispute, called by us a debate, during which it turned out that several of the boys present were on my side and several on the side of my rival, and which debate at times developed into a deafening din and brought us perilously near to throwing each other down from the top of the bell tower, it was decided that we must fight a duel. Then the question arose where to obtain weapons. Neither pistols nor swords were to be had anywhere, and the situation became very perplexing. All our emotions, which a moment before had reached the limits of excitement, were suddenly concentrated on how to find a way out of the difficulty which had arisen. Among the company was a friend of mine, a boy named Torchenevov, who had a very squeaky voice, and whom we all considered a very comical fella. While we were sitting pondering on what was to be done, he suddenly chirped up and exclaimed, "If it's difficult to get pistols, it's easy to get cannon." Everybody laughed, as they always did at everything he said. "What are you laughing at, you silly devils?" he retorted. "It's quite possible to use cannon for your purpose. There's only one drawback. You've decided that one of you must die, but in a duel with cannon both of you might die. If you consent to take such a risk, then to carry out my proposal is the easiest thing in the world." What he proposed was that we should both go to the artillery range, where firing practice was held, lie down and hide somewhere between the guns and the targets and await our doom. Whichever of us should be hit by a random shell would be the one fated to die. We all knew the artillery range very well. It was not far away in the mountains encircling the town. It was a fairly large tract of land, from 6 to 9 miles square, which was absolutely forbidden to enter at certain times of the year during firing practice, and which was strictly guarded on all sides. We often went there, chiefly at night, at the instigation of 2 big boys named Avyazov and Denisenko, who had a certain authority over us, to collect, or more truly to steal, the copper parts of the used shells and the scraps of lead which lay scattered about after the shells had burst, and which we later sold by weight for a good price. Although it was strictly forbidden to collect, let alone sell, the remnants of the shells, we nevertheless contrived to do so by taking advantage of moonlight nights and of those times when the guards were less vigilant. As a result of the fresh debate held on Turchanevo's proposal, it was categorically decided by all present to carry out this project the very next day. According to the stipulations of the seconds, who were Kerensky and Korkanady on my side, and on the side of my rival the 2 strange boys whom he had brought along with him, we were to go to the artillery range early in the morning before the firing began, and at approximately 100 yards from the targets lie down at a certain distance from each other in some large shell hole where no one could see us, and remain there until dusk. Whichever one was still alive by then could leave and go where he wished. The seconds also decided to remain all day near the range by the banks of the river Karjche, and in the evening to look for us in our holes to find out the result of the duel. If it should turn out that one or both of us were merely wounded, then they would do the necessary, and if it should turn out that we had been killed, they would then spread the tale that we had gone to collect copper and lead, not knowing that there would be firing that day, and so had been wiped out. The next morning at break of day, the whole party of us, supplied with provisions, made our way to the Karjche. Arriving there, we 2 rivals were given our share of the provisions, and were conducted by 2 of the seconds to the range, where we lay down in separate hollows. The seconds returned to the others at the river and passed the time fishing. So far everything had seemed rather a joke, but when the firing began it was anything but a joke. I do not know either the form or the sequence in which the subjective experiences and mental associations of my rival flowed, but I do know what proceeded in me as soon as the firing started. What I experienced and felt when the shells began to fly and burst over my head, I remember now as if it were only yesterday. At the beginning I was completely stupefied, but soon the intensity of feeling which flooded through me, and the force of logical confrontation of my thought increased to such an extent that at each moment I thought and experienced more than during an entire 12 months. Simultaneously there arose in me for the first time the whole sensation of myself, which grew stronger and stronger, and a clear realisation that through my thoughtlessness I had put myself in a situation of almost certain annihilation, because at that moment my death seemed inevitable. Instinctive fear in face of this inevitability soon took possession of my entire being, that surrounding realities seemed to disappear, leaving only an unconquerable living terror. I remember I tried to make myself as small as possible, and to take shelter behind a ridge in the ground, so as to hear nothing and think about nothing. The trembling which began in the whole of my body reached such a frightful intensity that it was as if each tissue vibrated independently, and, in spite of the roaring of the guns, I very distinctly heard the beating of my heart, and my teeth chattered so hard that it seemed as if at any moment they would break. I will remark here, by the way, that in my opinion, it was owing to this incident in my youth that there first arose in my individuality certain data, which later took definite form thanks to various conscious actions upon me on the part of certain normally educated people, data which have always prevented me from being perturbed by life questions in which exclusively my own egoistic interests were at stake, and from acknowledging or experiencing any but authentic fears, while on the other hand they have enabled me, without being carried away or deluded, to understand the fear of another and to enter into this position. I do not remember how long I lay there in this state. I can only say that in this case, as always and in everything, our most supreme, inexorable sovereign, time, did not fail to assert his rights, and I began to grow accustomed to my ordeal, as well as to the roar of the cannon and the bursting of the shells around me. Little by little, the tormenting thoughts of the possibility of my sad end began to disappear. Although, as usual, the firing was broken up into several periods, it was impossible to escape during the intervals, chiefly because of the danger of falling into the hands of the guards. There was nothing to be done but to keep lying there quietly. After eating some lunch, I even, without knowing it, fell asleep. Evidently the nervous system, after such intense activity, urgently demanded rest. I do not know how long I slept, but when I woke up it was already evening and everything was quiet. When I was fully awake and realised clearly the reasons for my being in that place, I first assured myself with great joy that I was safe and sound. And it was only when this egoistic gladness of mine had subsided that I suddenly remembered and began to feel concerned about my comrade in misfortune. So, creeping quietly out of my hole and taking a good look round, I went over to the place where he should have been. Seeing him lying there motionless, I was very frightened, though I thought and was even quite sure that he was asleep. But when I suddenly noticed blood on his leg, I completely lost my head, and all the hatred of the day before turned into pity. With a fear as great as I had experienced only a few hours earlier for my own life, I crouched down as though still instinctively trying not to be seen. I was still in this position when the seconds crawled up to me on all fours. Seeing me looking so strangely at the outstretched Karpenko, and then noticing the blood on his leg, they felt that something terrible had happened, and crouching there, glued to the spot, they also began to stare at him. As they later told me, they too were quite certain that he was dead. The whole group of us remained as though self-hypnotised until accidentally we were roused out of our stupor by Kerensky. As he later explained, having been for some time in a cramped position while staring at Karpenko, he suddenly felt his corn hurting him, and leaning forward a little to change his position, he noticed that the edge of Karpenko's coat was moving at regular intervals. Creeping nearer, he became convinced that he was breathing, and informed us of this almost with a shout. Instantly brought back to our senses, we also crept forward, and right there in the ditch, round the motionless Karpenko, we began, constantly interrupting each other, to deliberate on what was to be done. Suddenly, by some kind of tacit agreement, we made a chair of our arms and carried Karpenko to the river. We stopped at the ruins of an old brick factory, and there, having hurriedly made an improvised bed out of some of our clothes and laid Karpenko on it, we began to examine the wound. It appeared that only one leg had been grazed by shrapnel and not in a dangerous place. As Karpenko was still unconscious and no one knew what to do, one of us ran off to find a friend of ours in the town, an assistant surgeon, who was also a member of the cathedral choir, while the others washed the wound and somehow or other bandaged it. The assistant surgeon soon arrived in his buggy, and we explained to him that the accident had occurred while we were collecting copper, not knowing that the firing would take place. Having examined the wound, he said that it was not dangerous and that the fainting was due to loss of blood. In fact, when he administered a whiff of smelling salts, the patient immediately came to himself. We, of course, begged the assistant surgeon not to tell anyone how the accident had happened, since it would certainly get us into great trouble because of the strict orders against trespassing on the firing range. As soon as Karpenko came to, he looked round at everyone present, and when, resting his gaze on me longer than on the others, he smiled, something moved within me, and I was overcome with remorse and pity. From that moment I began to feel towards him as towards a brother. We carried the patient home and explained to his family that, in crossing a ravine to go fishing, a boulder had become dislodged and fallen and injured his leg. His parents believed our tale, and I obtained their permission to spend every night at his bedside until his recovery. During those days, while he was still weak and lay in bed, I took care of him like a kind-hearted brother, and, talking about one thing and another, our close friendship began. As for the love of Our Lady, on whose account all this had occurred, in Karpenko as well as in me, this feeling has suddenly evaporated. Soon after his recovery, his parents took him to Russia, where later he passed his examinations and was admitted to some technical institute. For several years after this incident, I did not see Karpenko, but regularly on each of my saints' days and birthdays, I received a long letter from him, in which he usually began by describing his inner and outer life in detail, and went on to ask my opinion on a long list of questions which interested him, chiefly on religious subjects. His first serious enthusiasm for our common ideas arose 7 years after the duel I have described. One summer, while travelling to Kars for the holidays by mail coach, at that time there was no railway there, he passed through Alexandropol, and learning that I was there at the time, he stopped off to see me. I had gone to Alexandropol that summer in order to carry out, in solitude and without being disturbed, certain practical experiments relating to questions which particularly interested me then, concerning the influence of the vibrations of sound on various types of human beings as well as on other forms of life. The day he arrived I had lunch with him and suggested that he should accompany me to the large stable which I had converted into an original kind of laboratory where I used to spend every afternoon. He examined everything that I had there and became so interested in what I was doing that, when he left that day for Kars to visit his family, he decided to return in 3 days. On his return he stayed with me almost the entire summer, going only for a day or two from time to time to see his family in Kars. At the end of the summer, several members of our recently formed group, the Seekers of Truth, joined me in Alexandropol, with the object of going to make some excavations among the ruins of Ani, the ancient capital of Armenia. On this expedition, Karpenko joined us for the first time, and, being in contact for several weeks with various members of our group, he was gradually drawn into the sphere of the questions which interested us. When the expedition was over, he returned to Russia, and soon afterwards obtained his diploma as a mining engineer. I did not see him again for 3 years, but thanks to our uninterrupted correspondence, we did not lose touch with each other. Karpenko also corresponded during this period with other members of the Seekers of Truth with whom he had become friends. At the end of these 3 years he became a full member of our original society, and from then on took part in several serious expeditions of ours in Asia and Africa. It was during one of these big expeditions, when we were attempting to cross the Himalayas from the Pamar region to India, that the incident occurred which was the cause of his premature death. From the start we had encountered great difficulties. In our journey up to the northwestern slopes of the Himalayas, while crossing a steep mountain pass, a large avalanche buried us all in snow and ice. With much effort all but 2 of us extricated ourselves from beneath the snow. Although we dug out the 2 others as fast as we could, they were already dead. One of them was Baron X, an ardent occultist, the other our guide, Karakir Kanu. By this misfortune we lost not only one of our good friends, but also a guide who knew the locality very well. By the way, it must be said that the entire region between the Hindu Kush Mountains and the great Himalayan range where this accident took place is a maze of narrow, intersecting gorges, the most bewildering of all the formations of similar capitalistic origin on the surface of our planet, over which we ever had to wander. These regions seem to have been intentionally made so confusing and complicated by the higher powers, in order that not a single human being should ever dare to try to find his way through them. After this accident, which deprived us of our guide, who was considered even among his own people as the one who knew best all the corners and windings of these regions, we wandered for several days, searching for a way out of this inhospitable place. Did they not have maps or compasses, every reader will doubtless ask. How not? We had them, and even more than necessary. But in fact, it would be fortunate for travellers if these so-called maps of uninhabited regions did not exist. A map, as my friend Yelov used to say, is called in a certain language by the word Korman Upaka, which means wisdom, and wisdom in that language is characterised as follows. Mental proof that 2 × 2 makes 7.5, minus 3 and a little bit of something. In my opinion, in employing contemporary maps, it would be ideally useful to put into practice the sense of a judicious saying which declares, if you wish to succeed in anything, then ask a woman for advice, and do the opposite. It is the same in this case. If you wish to find the right road, consult the map and take one in the opposite direction, and you can always be sure of reaching just where you want to go. These maps may perhaps be all right for these contemporary people who, sitting in their studies with neither the time nor the possibility to go anywhere, nevertheless have to write books on all kinds of travels and adventures. Indeed, these maps are excellent for such people because, thanks to them, they have more leisure for concocting their fantastic stories. Good maps may perhaps exist for some localities, but with all I've had to do with them in my life, from ancient Chinese maps to special military topographic maps of many countries, I was never able to find one that was of practical use when it was really needed. Certain maps may, at times, more or less help travellers to find their way in thickly populated areas, but in uninhabited regions, that is to say where they are the most necessary, as for instance in Central Asia, then, as I have already said, it would be better if they did not exist at all. Reality is distorted in them to the point of absurdity. Such maps have many undesirable and distressing consequences for genuine travellers. For example, let us say that, according to the indications of the map, you will have to cross the next day over a high elevation where, of course, you expect to find it cold. At night, while packing your baggage, you take out your warm clothes and other things for protection against the cold and put them aside. Tying up all the remaining things into packs and loading them on your animals, horses, yaks or whatever they are, you put the warm things on top of the packs in order to have them ready as soon as they should be needed. Well then, it almost always turns out that the next day, in spite of the indications of the map, you have to go down through valleys and lowlands, and that instead of the cold you expected, there is such a heat that you want to take off literally all your clothes. And as the warm things are neither packed up nor fastened tightly on the backs of the animals, they slip and shift at every step, disturbing the balance and bothering not only the animals, but also the travellers themselves. And what it means to have to repack on the way, he alone can understand who has had to do it, even if only once, on a long day's journey over the mountains. Of course, for journeys undertaken on behalf of some government or other for a certain political aim, and for which large sums are allocated, or on a journey for which the funds are dispersed by a banker's widow, an ardent theosophist, one might hire as many porters as one wishes to pack and unpack everything. But a genuine traveller has to do all this himself, and even if he should have servants, he would be bound to help them, as in the midst of the hardships of travel, it is difficult for a normal man to look on idly at the exertions of others. These contemporary maps are what they are, evidently because they are prepared by methods such as I myself once witnessed. It was when I was travelling with several members of the group, Seekers of Truth, through the Pamirs, past the Alexander Free Peak. At that time, the headquarters of the surveyors from the Turkestan Military Topographic Department were located in one of the valleys near this peak. The chief surveyor was a certain colonel, a good friend of one of our travelling companions, and because of this we made a special visit to their camp. The colonel had several young staff officers with him as assistants. They welcomed us with great joy, as they'd been living for several months in places where, for hundreds of miles, there was scarcely a single living soul. We stayed with them 3 days, intending to have a good rest in their tents. When we were getting ready to leave, one of the young officers begged permission to come with us, as he had to make a map of a locality 2 days' distance in the direction we were going. He brought along 2 private soldiers to assist him. In a certain valley we came across a camp of nomad Karakagis and entered in conversation with them. The officer who was with us also spoke their language. One of the Karakagis was elderly and obviously an experienced man. The officer, one of my friends, and I asked this Karakagis to share a meal with us, hoping that we might profit by his knowledge of these places to extract from him such information as we needed. We ate and spoke. We had brought bags made of sheep's stomachs which had been stuffed with excellent korma, and the officer also had vodka which he had brought from Tashkent, and which these nomads greatly relish, particularly when none of their own people see what they are drinking. While pouring down the vodka, The Karakas gave us various hints about these regions and indicated where certain points of interest were to be found. Pointing to a perpetually snow-capped mountain which was already familiar to us, he said, "You see that summit yonder? Well, just behind it there is this and that, and there is also the famous cave of Iskandar." The officer sketched all this down on paper. He was, by the way, rather a good artist. When we had finished eating and the Karakas had gone back to his camp, I looked at the drawing which the officer had made and saw that he had put everything that the old man had described not behind the mountain as the latter had indicated, but in front of it. I pointed out this discrepancy to him, and it appeared that the officer had confused in front of with behind, as in that language the words behind and in front of, bote and pute, are almost the same. And to someone who does not know this language well, they sound almost alike, especially when they are pronounced quickly with other words. When I explained all this to the officer, he merely said, "Oh well, devil take it," and he slammed his sketchbook shut. He had been drawing for almost 2 hours, and of course did not wish to do it all over again, the more so as we were all ready to proceed on our way. I am sure that this sketch was afterwards embedded in a map exactly as the officer had made it. Later, the printer of the maps, having never been to these regions, would place these details not on the side of the mountain where they belong, but on the other side, and of course this is where our brother traveller will expect to find them. With few exceptions, everything connected with the making of these maps proceeds in this way. Therefore, when a map indicates that you are approaching a river, you should not be surprised to come across one of the gorgeous daughters of Mr. Himalaya. And so we continued for several days at random, without a guide, observing great caution to avoid meeting any of those bands of brigades who, particularly at that time, were not great lovers of the Europeans who fell into their hands, and transformed them with solemn ceremony into captives, and later, with no less ceremony, exchanged them with some other tribe inhabiting this part of the service of our dear planet for a good horse, or a rifle of the latest model, or simply for a young girl, also of course a captive. Moving from place to place, we reached a small stream and decided to follow its course, reckoning that it might ultimately lead us somewhere. We did not even know whether it would lead us north or south, as the area we were in was a watershed. We followed the banks of this stream as long as we could, but soon, when they became very steep and almost impassable, we decided to go along the bed of the stream itself. We had not gone more than a few miles in this way when it was apparent that the stream, swollen by the water from numerous small tributaries, was rising to such a height that it was becoming impossible to continue our journey along its bed, and we were obliged to stop and deliberate seriously how to proceed. After long discussions, we decided to slaughter all the goats which we had brought with us for transporting our things and for our subsistence, in order to make borkadoks out of their skins, which we could inflate and attach to a raft, and thus float further down the river. To carry out this decision of ours, we chose a convenient place not far from the stream, where we could easily defend ourselves against any danger and set up our camp. Finding that it was too late to do anything more that day, we pitched our tents and, lighting fires in our customary way, we ate and lay down to sleep, having of course arranged watchmen to take turns during the night. The first thing next day, with the consent of our consciences, degenerated like those of all contemporary people and corresponding exactly to the requirements of hell, we killed all the goats, which only the day before we had regarded as our sincere friends and associates in overcoming the difficulties of the journey. After this admirable Christian Mohammedan manifestation, one of us began to cut their meat into small pieces in order to roast it and fill some of the skins. Some began to prepare the bordioks and inflate them. Others twisted the goat's intestines to make cords for tying the raft together and attaching the bordioks, and still others, including myself, took axes and went to look for hard wood suitable for the raft. In our search we wandered rather a long distance from our camp. We were looking for a kind of plane tree called there karakac, and for a fibrous birch. Of all the wood to be found in that neighbourhood, only these two kinds were, in our opinion, strong enough to withstand collisions with boulders and rocks in the narrow passages and over the rapids. Near our camp we came across chiefly fig trees and other varieties not hard enough for our purpose, As we were going along examining trees, we suddenly saw, sitting on the ground, a man belonging to one of the local tribes. Having talked it over amongst ourselves, we decided to go up to him and ask him where the trees we needed were to be found. Approaching nearer, we saw that he was clothed in rags, and we could tell by his face that he was a kind of Ovorinan, that is, a man who was working on himself for the salvation of his soul, or, as the Europeans would say, a fakir. As I have happened to use the word fakir, I do not consider it superfluous to digress a little in order to throw some light on this famous word. It is indeed one of the many empty words which, on account of the incorrect meaning given them, particularly in recent times, has an automatic action upon all contemporary Europeans, and has become one of the chief causes of the progressive dwindling of their thinking capacity. Although the word fakir in the meaning given it by Europeans is unknown to the peoples of Asia, nevertheless this same word is in use there almost everywhere. Fakir, or more correctly fakar, has at its roots the Turkoman word meaning beggar, and among almost all the peoples of the continent of Asia, whose speech is derived from ancient Turkoman, this word has come down to our day with the meaning of swindler or cheat. As a matter of fact, to express this meaning of swindler or cheat, two different words are used amongst these peoples, both derived from ancient Turkoman. One is this word fakir, and the other is lori. The former is the word used for a cheat or swindler, who uses his guile to take advantage of others by way of their religiousness, while the latter is applied to someone who simply takes advantage of their stupidity. The name lori, by the way, is given to all gypsies, both as a people and as individuals. Generally speaking, gypsies are found among all other peoples and everywhere lead a nomadic life. They are chiefly engaged in dealing in horses, tinkering, in singing at feasts, fortune-telling, and kindred occupations. They usually make their camps near populated places and deceive naive townspeople and villagers by every kind of cunning. Consequently, the word lori, denoting the gypsy people, has from long ago come to be used in Asia for every person, regardless of race, who is a swindler or a cheat. From conveying the meaning which Europeans wrongly ascribe to the word fakir, several words are employed among Asiatic peoples, the most widely used being Ezi-Ezanoran Barni-Uran, which comes from the Turkoman spoken language and means he who beats himself. I have myself read and heard many statements by Europeans about these so-called fakirs, asserting that their tricks are supernatural and miraculous, whereas actually, in the judgment of all more or less normal people in Asia, such tricks are performed by unconscionable swindlers and cheats of the highest order. To show what confusion the wrong use of this word has caused among Europeans, I think it will be sufficient to say that, although I have travelled in almost all the countries where these fakirs, as imagined by Europeans, are supposed to live, I have never seen a single one of them, but I did have the good fortune recently to see a genuine fakir in the sense used by people of the continent of Asia, only not in India or any of these countries where Europeans think they live, but in the very heart of Europe, in the city of Berlin. I was strolling one day along Kuffenstensdamm in the direction of the main entrance to the zoological gardens, when I saw on the pavement on a little hand wagon a cripple who had lost both legs, turning an antediluvian musical box. In Berlin, the capital city of Germany, as in other large centres representing, as it were, the epitome of contemporary civilization, it is forbidden to ask for charity directly, but anyone who wishes may beg and will not be bothered by the police if he grinds an old barrel organ or sells empty matchboxes or indecent postcards and various kindred literature. This beggar, dressed like a German soldier, was turning his musical box, which had half its notes missing. As they passed by, I threw him a few small coins, and, happening to glance at him, his face seemed familiar to me. I did not question him, as in general I did not then, any more than now, risk speaking alone with strangers in my broken German, but I began to think where I could have seen him before. When I had finished my business, I returned along the same street. The cripple was still there. I approached very slowly and looked at him closely, trying to recall why his face was so familiar, but at that moment I could not. It was only on arriving at the Romanish cafe that it suddenly came to me that the man was no other than the husband of a lady who, several years before in Constantinople, was sent to me by a close friend of mine with a letter of introduction, appealing to me to give her medical treatment. The lady's husband was a former Russian officer who, it seems, had been evacuated from Russia to Constantinople with Wrangel's army. I then remembered how the young lady had come to me with a dislocated shoulder and her body covered with bruises. While I was busy with her arm, she told me that her husband had beaten her because she had refused to sell herself for a good sum to a certain Spanish Jew. Somehow or other, with the help of Doctors Viktorov and Maximovich, I put her shoulder right, after which she left. 2 or 3 weeks after that, I was sitting in a Russian restaurant in Constantinople called the Black Rose, when this lady approached me. Nodding in the direction of a man with whom she'd been sitting, she said, "There he is, my husband," and added, "I've made it up with him again. He's really quite a good man, although he does lose his temper at times." Having told me this, she quickly left. It was only then that I understood what kind of woman she was. Afterwards I sat there and scrutinised the face of this officer for a long time, as I was interested in such a rare type. Now here was this same officer, a legless cripple, in the uniform of a German soldier, turning a musical box and collecting small German coins. In the course of a day, a great many small coins were thrown by kind-hearted passers-by to this unfortunate victim of the war. This man, in my opinion, was a genuine fakir in the sense understood by all Asiatic peoples. As for his legs, would to God that mine were as sound and strong as his. Well, enough about this. Let us return to the story we had begun. And so we approached the Ezi-Ezonora Boran, and after appropriate greetings sat down beside him. Before asking him what we wanted to know, we began to speak with him, observing the various conventional courtesies habitual among these people. It is interesting to remark that the psyche of the people inhabiting these regions is totally different from that of the Europeans. Among the latter, almost always what is in the thoughts is on the tongue. Among Asiatics this is not the case. The duality of the psyche is highly developed. Any person of these regions, however polite and friendly he may be outwardly, may nonetheless inwardly hate you and be thinking out all kinds of harm for you. Many Europeans who have lived among Asiatics for decades without understanding this particularity of theirs, and who judge them according to themselves, always lose a great deal as a result of this, and create many misunderstandings which might have been avoided. These people of Asia are full of pride and self-love. Each of them, irrespective of his position, demands from everyone a certain attitude towards himself as a person. Among them, the main thing is kept in the background, and one must lead up to it as if it were just by the way. If not at the best, they will, for instance, direct you to the right when your road lies to the left. On the other hand, if you do everything as it should be done, then not only will they give you accurate directions, but will even be eager to help you, if possible themselves, to reach your intended destination. Therefore, when we approached this man, we did not begin by asking him what we wanted to know. God forbid that we should do so before observing the necessary conventions. After sitting down beside him, we spoke of the beauty of the scenery, and told him that we were there for the first time, asked how the surrounding conditions suited him, and so on. And only much later I remarked, as if in passing, "We need such and such wood for a certain purpose, but we are not able to find it anywhere around here." He replied that he greatly regretted that he did not know where it could be found, as he had only been in the neighbourhood a short time, but that a certain respected old man, who was his teacher, must know. He lived behind the hill in a cave, and had been there a long time, and knew the locality very well. He thereupon got up to go to him, but Dr. Sariolgi stopped him and asked whether he could see his respected teacher and ask him ourselves about the wood we needed. He replied, "Of course, let us go together. He is a man who is almost a saint and is always ready to help anyone." As we went, we saw from a long way off a man sitting in a meadow under a tree, and our guide, without waiting for us, ran to him, and after telling him something, beckoned to us to approach. We exchanged the customary greetings and sat down beside him. At that moment another of the local inhabitants came and sat down beside us. As it turned out later, he also was a pupil of this venerable Onnu-Avoronan. The face of this old man appeared to us so benevolent and not of ordinary humankind that, without any of the usual preliminary manipulations, and without concealing anything, we told him what had happened to us and how we thought of making our way out of that region. We also told him why we had come to him. He listened to us with great attention, and after thinking a little said that the stream by whose banks we had stopped was a tributary of the river Chitral, which flows into the river Kabul, which in its turn flows into the Indus. There were many roads, he told us, leading out of that region, but they were all long and arduous. If we were able to travel as we had planned, and if we were fortunate enough to avoid the banks inhabited by people who were not at all friendly to strangers, then our plan would be the best that could be devised. As for the kind of wood we were seeking, he thought it was not only suitable, and that the best wood for the purpose would be cornelian cherry, and added that there was a dell to the left of the path by which we had come, where thick clumps of these trees grew. All of a sudden there was a sound from nearby, the kind that makes a man shiver from head to foot. The old man calmly turned his head, and with his old voice called out in a special way. Then, out of the bushes, in all its beauty and strength, emerged a huge grey bear, carrying something in its mouth. As it came nearer to us, the old man called out again, and the bear, looking at us with glittering eyes, moved slowly towards him and laid the thing it was carrying at his feet, then turned round and lumbered back into the bushes. We were, in the full sense of the word, stupefied, and the trembling which took possession of our bodies was so strong that our teeth were chattering. The old man explained to us in a kindly voice that the bear was a good friend of his, who sometimes brought him jungari. Jungari is a kind of maize which grows in these regions and is used there as a substitute for wheat, and it was this that the bear had laid at his feet. Even after these reassuring words, we were unable to fully recover our composure, and looked at each other in deep silence, our faces revealing utter bewilderment. The old man, rising heavily from his seat, aroused us out of our stupor and said that it was the hour for his customary walk, and if we wished he could accompany us to the dell where the cherry trees grew. Then he uttered a prayer and went on ahead, all of us with his pupils following behind. At the dell we did indeed see many clumps for this cherry, and then and there everyone, even including the old man himself, began cutting down the trees we needed, choosing the biggest. When we had cut 2 good loads, considering this to be enough, we asked the old man whether he would consent to come with us to our camp, which was not far off, and permit one of our friends to make an exact portrait of him there, which could be done quickly by means of a special small machine he had. At first the old man refused, but his pupils helped us to persuade him, so taking our loads we went back to the banks of the stream where we had left the rest of our company at work. On reaching them we quickly explained everything, and Professor Skridlov took the old man's picture with his camera and immediately began developing it. While he was doing this, we all gathered round the old man under the shade of a fig tree. Among us was Vitvitskaya, who had her neck bound up as she had been suffering for some months from a painful infection of the throat, fairly common in the mountains, which had the appearance of a goitre. Seeing her bandaged, the old man asked what the trouble was. We explained, and calling her to him, the old man closely examined the swelling. He told Vitvitskaya to lie on her back, and then he began to massage the swelling in various ways, at the same time whispering certain words. We were all indescribably amazed when after 20 minutes of massage, Vitvitskaya's enormous swelling began to disappear before everyone's eyes, and after a further 20 minutes absolutely nothing remained of it. Just then Professor Skridlov came back, having finished developing and printing the old man's photograph. He too was greatly astonished and, bowing deeply before the old man, humbly entreated him to relieve him of an attack from which he had been suffering acutely the last few days, of his long-established kidney trouble. Diezos Norvoron asked him for various details of his illness, and immediately sent off one of his pupils, who soon returned with the root of a certain small shrub. Giving this root to the professor, the old man said, you must take one part of this root with 2 parts of the bark of the fig tree, which you can find almost everywhere. Boil them well together, and every other day for 2 months drink a glassful of this liquid before going to sleep." Then he and his pupils looked at his photograph, which the professor had brought, and which astounded them all, particularly the pupils. We invited the old man to share our meal of fresh goat korma and pukhand cakes. Pukhand is a flour prepared from roasted barley, which makes the tastiest of breads, which he did not refuse. In the course of the conversation we learned that he had formerly been a top bashi, or chief of artillery, of the Emir of Afghanistan, the grandfather of the then reigning Emir, and that when he was 60 years old he was wounded in a rebellion of Afghans and Balochis against some European power, after which he returned to his native Khorasan. When he had completely recovered from his wounds, he no longer wished to return to his post, as he was getting on in years, but decided to devote the rest of his life to the salvation of his soul. First he got in touch with Persian dervishes. Later, although not for long, he was a Baptist. And still later, returning to Afghanistan, he entered a monastery in the environs of Kabul. When he had understood everything he needed, and was convinced that people were no longer necessary to him, he began to look for an isolated spot far from human habitation. Having found this place, he had settled here in the company of a few persons who wished to live according to his indications, and was awaiting his death, as he was already 98 years old, and it is rare nowadays for anyone to pass 100. As the old man prepared to leave, Yelov also addressed him, asking whether he would be good enough to advise him what to do about his eyes. Several years before, in the Transcarpathian region, he had contracted trachoma, and in spite of all kinds of treatments, the malady had not been cured, but had become chronic. "Although my eyes," he said, "do not bother me all the time, nevertheless in the mornings they are always closed up with excretions, and a change of climate or a sandstorm makes them rather painful." The old Ezoni Avarian advised him to grind some copper sulphate very fine and, every evening before going to sleep, to moisten a needle with his own saliva, dip it into the ground sulphate and draw it between the eyelids, and to continue this treatment for a certain period of time. After he had given Yelov this advice, the venerable man rose and, making to each of us the gesture which in these regions signifies what we call a blessing, went towards his dwelling place, and all of us, even our dogs, accompanied him. On the way we resumed our conversation with the old man. Suddenly Karpenko, without consulting any of us, addressed him in the Uzbek language and said, "Holy Father, as by the will of fate we have met you in such unusual surroundings, a man great in knowledge and rich in experience of ordinary life, as well as on the level of self-preparation for the being after death, we are all convinced beyond doubt that you will not refuse to give us your advice. Of course, so far as this is possible, on the life we should live and the ideals that we should hold before us, in order that we may ultimately be able to live as designed from above, and as is worthy of man." Before replying to this strange question of Karpenko's, the old man began to look round as if he were searching for something, and then went towards the trunk of a fallen tree. He sat down on it, and when we had seated ourselves, some on the tree and others simply on the ground, he turned to all of us and slowly began to speak. His reply to Karpenko's question developed into a kind of lengthy sermon of profound interest and significance. The words then spoken by this old Ezanuna Avorian I will also record, but only in the 3rd series of my writings, in a chapter entitled "The Astral Body of Man, Its Needs and Possibilities of Manifestation According to Law." Here I will merely touch upon the results of the healing by this venerable man, which I have verified by inquiries over many years. From that time on, Vitvitskaya never had a recurrence or even any of the symptoms of the malady from which she had been suffering. Professor Skridlov did not know how to express his gratitude towards the old man who had cured him, probably forever, of the sufferings which had tortured him for 12 years. And as for Yelov, A month later his trachoma was gone. After this event, significant for all of us, we stayed there another 3 days, during which we split the wood, made the raft and prepared everything we had planned. Early in the morning of the 4th day, the improvised raft was launched into the river, and boarding it, we began to move downstream. At first our peculiar craft could not always move with the current alone, and at some places we had to push it, and at others even carry it. But the deeper the river became, the easier it was for the raft to move by itself, and at times, in spite of its load, it would fly along like one possessed. We could not say that we felt completely secure, particularly when the raft passed through narrow places and collided against rocks, but later, when we were convinced of its sturdiness and of the efficiency of the device brought out by the engineer Samsonov, we were quite at ease and even began to crack jokes. This ingenious device of the engineer Samsonov was to attach 2 bordioks to the front and also to each side of the raft to serve as buffers whenever it should strike boulders. The 2nd day of our trip down the river, we exchanged shots with a band of natives who evidently belonged to one of the tribes living on the banks. During the firing, Piotr Karpenko was seriously wounded and died 2 years later, while still quite young, in one of the towns of central Russia. Rest in peace, rare and sincere friend.